Last time, we started a project transforming every empire on the Empires SMP. So far, we've done Dangthatsalongname's empire and Spawn Island, and next up is PearlescentMoon. You guys seem to really like the last one, so here I am doing it again. Let's get straight into it. The first thing that I do is I lay out a long line going from Spawn Island over to Pearl's empire, which is going to show her journey. Whilst Dangthatsalongname's journey was very direct and fast, Pearl takes a detour that takes several months in the history of this world. The main part of Pearl's journey takes place deep inside one of the dungeons left behind from Joey Graceffa's fallen empire. Pearl spends months down here in the darkness, searching for something that will give her empire an edge. Eventually, deep inside the labyrinth, she finds the treasure room, which houses 5 seeds. She takes 2 of these and they are said to have mystical properties, and maybe the seedling will be important later on. I build up the labyrinth in segments, which I can just copy and paste, which makes it quite easy to make a large, sprawling maze. I also hide quite a bit of loot down here and some chests, so if you're planning on playing the world download when it eventually comes out, then this might be a good place to get some loot. Going back up to the surface, Pearl takes one of the seedlings and buries it for safekeeping, just in case something was to happen to the other. She sets up a base on the beach where she does some fishing to get food and build a boat. I make some mini trees to spread around the area of the beach, just to make it feel a little bit more alive. It is a jungle island after all. I make a simple boat design and I wedge it in the shoreline of the western continent, which is where Pearl's empire is, showing how she crashed her boat on land. It's clearly just not Pearl's day, however, because once she gets out of her crashed vessel, she is met by a large viper, which attacks her and steals the magical seedling. Pearl has to go all the way back to Spawn Island, because there's no way she's getting it back from that massive thing, and then she makes her way to the site of her empire and plants the seed. As for the other seedling, it's guarded by the snake to this day, and I'm sure no other empires will want to get their hands on it to do something completely evil with it. Now that I'm done procrastinating, it's time to move on to Pearl's empire. Now, in this world, it is based in a plains biome that has a large river running through the middle of it. So this means that it's incredibly flat, with the water being flat and also, of course, the plains biome being incredibly plain and flat. So to deal with this, we're going to build an enormous beanstalk, which is going to house quite a few of the important buildings of the empire. Also, we're going to, instead of having it all very built up in one location like Dangthatsalongname's empire was, we're going to have little groups of buildings dotted around, and finally we're going to have a port area along the river where they can trade with other empires. Let's go! I get to work building up the beanstalk out of diamond blocks to get a nice organic structure in there before we start and add a gradient, which will make it look taller than it actually is. Then, after the gradient is added, I add a bunch of leaves around it, and then add some clouds which the palace is going to stand on. I make the clouds out of white stained glass and white stained glass panes, and I swirl them around the main beanstalk. Now, the shaders kinda make the white stained glass look a little bit like water, which I'm not sure if it's a good thing or not. Tell me what you guys think in the comments down below. Now it's time to recreate most of the buildings that Pearl already has in her empire, obviously up to the point where this video was created. And it's at this point when I really start to regret this, because whilst Dangthatsalongname's buildings were very symmetrical with relatively predictable block palettes, Pearl mixes loads of weird blocks that kinda shouldn't go together, but she somehow makes them, and her buildings are incredibly detailed. I transform every building apart from the 2 buildings that were made in the Empire's expansion video, which were on diagonals and incredibly difficult to replicate. However, I will still be including a transformation of them later on. The buildings are characterised by key features which run throughout each of them. For example, the fairly obvious large towers and slightly less obvious dormers that are in the roof of every building. The block palettes for the roof consists of dripstone, granite, and terracotta, which isn't a block palette for a roof I would usually use, so it'll be quite interesting playing around with that. Now that these original buildings are made, I position them around the Empire in places of significance. Later on, in these areas, large buildings themed to the original will stand here with small villages surrounding them, so this is an important step. Now I want to make custom landscapes for each of the buildings. So starting with the potion brewery, I raise a small cliff out of the ground, which very gradually comes up to a very leveled off point at the very top, which will frame this building perfectly and also maintains the plane's relatively flat feel. Next, I make a gradual incline up to the edge of the island, making a nice little cliff face. This is going to be where our barn and the 2 large storage silos are going to go next to it. This is the only other piece of landscape I'm going to make, because the other ones are going to be fairly small and easy to do. With all that set to grass and stone, I get to work detailing the rock faces. I also add in a little nether portal under the main cliff, which is reminiscent of the original Empire. Now I start building the potion brewery on top of the hill. Now it took me a while to get what I wanted from this build, because I wanted it to be mainly about the towers instead of the lower, flatter buildings. So instead of having the vat plug into the side of one of the lower buildings, I decided to plug it into the main tower in this almost cartoonish way, with a massive tube coming out of the top of its lower tower, and then going into the vat, and then going into the building. On the other side, to balance it out, I make this enormous cartoon-like chimney with billowing smoke coming out of the top. Now, the original idea was to have smoke coming out of all the windows, so it looked like the entire main tower was a large chimney, but that also kind of made it look like the house was on fire, which is not what we really wanted, so I decided to stray away from that idea. Now, the next building that we're going to tackle is this building that Pearl built in her second Empires SMP video. Now, the problem with this building is it shares a lot of its defining features with the potion brewery, and seeing as I want all of the mega builds to have their own unique feel, I decided to emphasize the features that are unique to this building, which are the windmill on top and the archways. So the archways gave me the idea to make this building into a massive greenhouse with a windmill on top, where maybe they can use the climate from the desert that this area of the Empire is quite close to grow more exotic crops for the Empire. I also stay away from the calcite for this building because it was used quite heavily on the last one, and as I said, I want them to be quite different. However, I also use the dripstone, but this time not as a rim round the middle like it would usually be used, but as windowsills in a similar style. Now, for the landscaping of this build, I just make a little hill with tiered areas for wheat farms that are going to sweep down the hill and into much of the surrounding areas when this thing is eventually done, with buildings dotted here and there in a similar style to the larger building. Now, I'm not joking when I say that placing all of this wheat actually took half as long as making the building itself, but there was something strangely therapeutic about it, so I guess it's okay. Moving back over to the coastal cliffs area that we made earlier in the video, it's time to start on the silos. So for these buildings I emphasise the gradient by adding an overhang at the top and at the bottom, making the foundation look really strong and making the overhang at the top look like some sort of waste product is leaking out of the silo. I also, for the top, use these onion dome roofs, and doing these roofs in one of the nearby biomes has been giving me nightmares for months. Trying to push that out of my mind, I move over to the barn. Now for this, on the lower level I change the wood into the same gradient type of thing that is on the silos to make this area fit together a bit more. But on top of that, I do add the wood as it usually would be in the original build. Now for the entrance, I use this large archway to form this enormous door, and once I've finished one entire half of the build, I just flip it over to the other side. So to link together these builds, I use these bridges that go between them. One between the barn and the silo, which has a rope coming up from the bottom of the barn to reach it, and another one going between the big silo and the smaller silo. And I really do think this just works to link the build together a whole lot more. Now I move on to the final of the larger builds in the kingdom, which is the palace. Now the original plan for this was to have buildings on each of the clouds which go and tower on top of the beanstalk. However, as you can probably tell, the beanstalk goes all the way up to height limit, so this wasn't really a viable option. So instead I opted to build buildings on the middle two clouds that swirl closest to the beanstalk, which makes it seem a lot more compact, and the other clouds still look good as supporting those other clouds in the centre. Now for this, I try and pull every style of each of the buildings in the Empire together. So this includes more subtle things like the towers having overhangs at the bottom and the top, which mirrors the silos from earlier, or more on the nose things like a pretty much direct replica of the greenhouse that we did earlier, and wheat fields. Moving back to the first of the larger buildings that we made this episode, it's time to make its village. Now for this, I wanted to theme it around the fact that possibly this isn't the healthiest area in the Empire, as it has quite a lot of chemicals used for the potion brewing. So there's lots of these tanks all over the place and vats filled with whatever they're using to make these potions, and some of the surrounding wildlife has taken a little bit of a hit, but we'll come back to making the trees in this area a little bit later. Instead of a fountain, I use this kind of plug in the ground that could hint that there's a large pool of goo under this village. The positioning of the nether portal in the centre of this village isn't a mistake either, because the way they get a lot of the ingredients for the potion is by taking it straight out of the portal. Now moving over to the section of the river between the large barn and the greenhouse, I decided to add a quick bridge here with some interesting land formations, just because it seemed like there needed to be a new way to get across the river in this part of the Empire. After that bit of world building's done, I move over to the large greenhouse, because that's the village that we're going to be doing next. So I mark out the buildings that are going to be scattered around, and then I use a world edit brush to paint in the paths and set all of the surrounding grass to farmland. And then I start placing in the wheat by hand. Actually, I don't do that. I can promise you that if I did all of that by hand, I'd be here till the end of time, so I'm going to use a world edit command to do it later. Next, I move on to making the buildings that are sprinkled throughout the wheat field. So I try to make each one have its own unique style and look, and I even try and include the original, which is something I wanted to do with the last build. However, it was just a little bit too big for that area, but it's nice to have this one here. My favourite building that I do here is the one by the riverside, because it has this really nice exaggerated roof style, and I imagine some sort of mad farmer fisherman lives here. Moving across the river to the barn and silo area, this village has got to be one of my favourites that I've made so far. I think it really goes very well with the style of the barn and the silos, because it's practically just those features mashed up together, but also I think I did a great job of capturing the features and each of the key parts, and my favourite building that I make is the first one that I actually make, because I just think it does a great job of showing all of these different features in the same place. Before I move on to the final of the villages, I just want to kind of clean up the bottom of the beanstalk, because right now it's looking a little bit of a mess and like it's just been plonked there on the terrain, and what I really want to see with this one is that it's pushed the earth up around it as the seedling that Pearl brought to the Empire was planted and grew and grew and grew until it became this massive monolithic structure. Now I start making the port area, which I know I said it was going to be along the river, but there's actually nowhere in the river that boats could physically get through because of the two bridges on either side. So I move it over to the side of the Empire that's facing Gem's Empire, because this is a much better position. I want these buildings to look very run down and chaotic, so to emulate this, I take inspiration from the neighbour's house from Hello Neighbour, and I'm sure you can probably see that in the first of the large houses. So on top of it, I use different types of fence and walls to make these spiky aerial things sticking up, which I imagine are probably lightning rods or something for storms blowing in from the sea. I also board up some of the windows to just make it look just that little bit more run down. And I want each of the buildings to have the same features once again, and have the same block palette as lots of the other buildings in the Empire, but really have their own thing going on. And then of course, at the side of the Empire, I add this nice lighthouse, which is just going to work to let ships into the Empire. Speaking of ships, it's now time to make some. So starting with the large one, I take quite a lot of elements of the galleon from Sea of Thieves, but I change it up a little bit by turning the sails into a different type of sail, and also making it quite a lot thinner with the cannons being below deck. Now, I really dislike building ships. There's just something about the shape of them that just makes it so awkward to make. But anyway, moving on to the small one, I modelled this pretty exactly off the sloop from Sea of Thieves, which is just a great game. If you've never played it, you should try it. And that's that. That's the final village that we have to make. Completed. Which means all that's left to do is to put in some trees, and then the entire empire is done. And of course, I'm going to do the trees off camera, because it's a little bit difficult, because I have to move around the entire empire, which can cause some issues with the replay mod and chunk borders. So, it's finished. Let's go and see what we've made this episode. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed and you haven't already, please like and subscribe because it really helps me out. And did you know only 9% of people make it this far in the video? So if you're one of those, why not try subscribing? And also, I'm sorry for the slow upload on this one, but I've had some important real life stuff going on and I spend hours and hours and hours on these projects, and of course, real life has to come first. So there'll always be another video on the way, but until then, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye!